Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 13. When the rebellions of the Getae were ended and the harvest of the year 181 could be carried out in peace, there was no delay on the part of the Romans to congratulate the victorious prince and bring to him a large and lavish delegation from their city. Coming with them was an honoured guest, Sextus Julius Caesar, the so-called co-consul of Rome. This title designated him as half-king of his empire, which was not a very impressive title because his brother Gaius held the title dictator, which is equal to or more powerful than king. The self-ignorance of Roman politics is a matter for another volume entirely, so know only that Sextus was treated as if he was a high ruler, but he was not able to make decisions without consulting his brother. His coming to Apollon was marked with sacrifices and games, which the Romans and Getae both found indispensable when historic negotiations were due. Pairisades did not attend these events because of more important business that I will detail once I have disposed of the Romans from our story for the time being. The root of the reason for Rome's interest in Apollon was little different now to when King Meticos had sat on the throne. This was the growing collection of ancient knowledge that Rome itself was building. If you are familiar with Roman ways, you will know that they never shied away from taking anything foreign to their bosom if they thought it might profit them, and hence what we call Roman culture is generally a mix of all the cultures they had bullied across the world. Their weapons were Iberian, their armour Gallic, their dress Etruscan, and their gods Greek. For those who don't know, most of the Greek cities were clients to Rome at this time, and it is said that the Romans had started to call the whole Mediterranean our sea, in open disregard for humility, let alone the impracticality of labelling such a large number of different places with such a simple name. Forgive me, for the topic of Rome always brings up many points which I wish more people knew. The main point is that they had been looting the world for Leuthosis treasures ever since learning such things existed, and their dealings with the Getae were part of this process. Thus, so too were their kind overtures towards the Bosporans. In fact, doubly so. This was not what was discussed openly at the Grand Symposium at Apollon, but it was what Pairisades and Sextus both understood to be the meaning of the conversation, as neither denied that they were attempting to establish the truth of the Golden Age. What had once been a secret was truly beyond concealment even at the far ends of the world from where the quest had commenced. Were the two empires of Rome and Coriscos to share what they found, the most complete picture yet would emerge. Neither side could tell to whose greater benefit this would be. Sextus proposed that the two empires be joined through marriage. Pairisades had already prepared for this term, and brought out his daughter Labda immediately to be introduced. Sextus took a liking to her, since she was precisely the sort of strange and highly educated foreigner that fascinated the Roman noble class. This match had the advantage of making her brother, Doraius, the eldest child in the prince's household, save for, technically, Diotrephes. Doraius was a man of fine character, who was an acceptable prince and would-be heir, whereas under the Leuthosis tradition that Pairisades toyed with, Labda would stand to inherit the dynasty, and there were few Greeks who could stomach such a notion in that time. Since Pairisades owed much to his forest folk soldiers, it is likely that Labda would have become a prominent queen had the Romans not purchased her, and you will find various people lamenting the loss of that opportunity to this day, who wish to see the symbolism of unity between all mankind and the disconnection of kingship from the tribe of Yimo so that it might belong to any who earned it. But since we are speaking here of inherited power, nothing of that sort would be suitable to a golden age, and I find the entire argument makes a weaker point to spite a stronger one. Labda stood to gain greatly from the match also, being once born in desperate times in forgotten lands, now entering the richest household in the richest city the world could offer. As a father, Pairisades discharged his duty well here. It was as a brother to Spartacus where he failed, in that this entire affair and his treaties with Rome were all passed by his own decree, not so much as consulting the councils of either capital, let alone the king. For as long as I have looked, I have never found evidence that Pairisades tried to inform his brother about any of this, and surely this is firm evidence that his mind was on a track entirely separate to that of common politics by this point. The reason for this was the recent arrival of Gwenna Greekspeaker and a wizened cadre of other Leuthosis sages, the first of the Scions of Gold. These silent shamans were now to be in receipt of new stones that Sextus paid to Pairisades on the acceptance of his treaty, all copies of stones held at Rome. The wedding was to take place in Rome, and none from the Spartacid dynasty would attend. Perhaps this saved their lives. There is little that does not happen in Rome, good or evil. But we must turn now to what Gwenna was assembling in Apollon. With all the runestones recovered translated by the coming of the year 180, the fall of the Golden Age was realized in living memory once again. I told you already that the word of Manos is afflicted with a terrible curse, to be always insufficient to spread across all people. What could cause such a thing? The answer is something you have seen many times. Aglow across the dark pane of night, we see the fires of the cosmic war every day. And in turn, those beasts of the cosmos can see us. They see peace, they see order, and they see a world that is not theirs. This is most irregular to them, and be they kind or malicious hearts, they cannot let the world be. That is why we were doomed from the beginning, but we all know it shall not be forever thus. As Gwenna spoke in the Grand Hall of Apollon, we are not able to protect ourselves on our own, not now and not then. But we are not on our own, and what you can do protects others, and what they can do protects you. Shields upon shields, your people know this. I will show you. We will tell you. The land of gold, seeped in magic, will be our prize. And the truth of the gods is what I have found. I tell to you, and do not cry or feel. No, the gods should not be forgiven for what they will make us do. This sinister address carried on with the telling of the first war on Earth, and I shall relay the true portions here as usual. It is well known that this world is filled with many gods, and you can always find people who have had experience with one or several of them personally. We know that the gods take interest in human affairs, and do not allow us to go about our lives unmolested, nor unrewarded. What we can say now on top of this is that the limits of the powers of the gods are quite natural, and they stem from this shield that Manos built when he created the world, called the Celestial Sphere, and various other names. What we hear and see of the gods in our world is but a fraction of their power, and a fraction of their intent. And their intent for this realm, balanced up, is rarely aligned with ours. Aside from Manos, Taurus and Imo, there have been no gods who did not cause trouble in the world, and it was back in the first moment when the cosmic beings discovered how to influence us that the Golden Age came to an end. The way they achieved this was by coming up to the holes burned in the Celestial Sphere and blowing gently over the land. These winds carried whispers that resonated with the souls of humankind, and they came to feel that they were in the service of that being whose breath they harbored. These beings came with countless names and goals, and while there is little direct evidence in most cases, it is common these days to assume that most gods we cannot trace back to corruptions of Leuthosis paragons were actually inserted into our minds by these outside beings. For example, there are those who have studied the origins of Juno in Rome. This name actually refers to Hera, but then who is Hera? There is no Leuthosis god of this name, and remember that only the Leuthosis gods were created within the world itself after the death of the triumvirate of Manos, Taurus and Imo. This means that the various places in the world who came to know Hera independently, there are many, as documented in the work I am summarizing, called The Providence of Great Spirits, compiled by Flaccus of Lilybaeum, must have all been places where the breath of Hera's progenitor fell. And by drawing these places onto a map, we can track the direction of this wind and determine the very star Hera came to us from. This is a happy case, since Hera's spirit seems to benefit the world, but its true intention is cast into question by virtue of its cosmic origin, and really it pains one to think how much uncertainty there is in all this. The recourse here, as ever, is to rely on one's faith to see them through such studies. The reason to be dour comes from Gwenna's work at Apollon, as the original canon that formed the teachings of the Scions of Gold makes it obvious that turning the minds of men to war was the foremost effect of the initial rush of cosmic winds. It is worth remembering that revelations like these were as powerful to the Leuthosis as they were to everyone else, so be sure to correct those who include this information under the bracket of Leuthosis religion, when in truth Leuthosis religion was torn apart by the curse of stellar winds as much as any other pantheon. What they knew in their hearts, though, was close to the truth, that it was straying from Manos that brought about calamity, whether they remembered the cause or not. With the vile interferences of the cosmos, the love of Manos' creation ceased to be universal, and respect for the labourer kings gave way to those who felt they might be made kings for invisible or immaterial reasons, and there was no hope for harmony between the growing ranks of mankind. There was war of the kind not recorded anywhere else, in which a child was told from the day they were born that they would fight a battle on a certain day in a certain place, allotted to them by the war masters of those times, who retained the power to order the world Manos had bequeathed them. And fight they did, with all manner of tools, techniques and devices, most of which were not possible for those who wrote the runes of these times to explain, because they could only be made by following the guidance of the paragons when they were alive and their spirits strong. But in time, even great leaders like Jaius, great judges like Dagon, and 100 more famous heroes of the time were slain in the endless fighting. One battle stands out, the Battle of the Dacian Hills, which is what we now call the Sarmatian Mountains. There, the ancestors of the Getae and the Kariskosi Leuthosis fought for 700 years, the magic of the world turning their blood and bodies into ever-increasing volumes of rock and soil, until finally the mountains were too steep to fight over, and the peoples on either side were split apart. We do not have them, but there could be similar tales of horrid struggle behind each mountain range in the world, though at least one range, the Alps, is known to have been created by the sudden movement of the Attali Peninsula from the sea, which, as I said before, was caused by the coming of the Getae to Apollon and the slaughter of the peaceful people who first lived on that hill. How ordinary it must have been for the land to change in unthinkable ways in those times. The warring destroyed much of what humankind once was, and diminished itself in the process, leading to the state of unease and distrust that permeates from the beginning of history to today, in which each person is given to a distinct peoples, who were forever at war and afraid of other such peoples around them. Is there any faster way to describe the world? Since it was not always like this, do you not wonder if it would be possible to change this arrangement? If so, you are in fine company, for it was the goal of the founding members of the Scions of Gold to use their increased understanding of the world's curses to treat these maladies. The rediscovery of ancient arts, such as blood magic, and the understanding of the gods as potentially malevolent and at least disruptive creatures, could now promise a return to gold for the first time. This is what Prince Pairisades was celebrating when his daughter was wed in a far-off land. And it was this strange message of hope and expectation that reached all parts of the Bosporan Empire, along with a simple order, that all who served the Spartakids should now also service the Scions of Gold. Few could imagine what that command could mean, but those peering through the stars knew that what was brewing in the cauldron of mortality was not to their tastes, and therefore, almost as soon as the idea of an organized religious movement was spread, a foul wind came to the world, and enemies were made of friends. This brings us to a dramatic affair that begins to recapture the fury of battle between awakened peoples, only a fraction of what those civilizations in the Golden Age could deploy to battle, and that was yet more incomparable still to the battles the gods are born and killed in moment by moment right above our heads. That there was some link between this new temple, the Scions of Gold, and the Leuthosis was one of the few things that people could be sure about in the early days. This was a final insult to a certain group of allied peoples, the Roxolani. Recall that before Pairisades had gone to the First Lands, it was the Roxolani who had dared contest territory with the Leuthosis, and it was from their captivity that Gwenna Greekspeaker herself was rescued. While they had submitted to Pairisades when he became the regional warlord, they had since moved their tribes further and further to the west, where they were able to establish something of a kingdom for themselves on the borders of the European forest. This was achieved by riding in the wake of their begrudged ruler Pairisades. This is because when Pairisades marched from Oyam to the Sarmatian mountains, there had been countless small towns and villages that submitted to him out of fear. He did not leave a garrison in any of those irrelevant places, since to do so would be to garrison his entire army before long. Since there had been a symbolic supplication though, Bosporan allies were free to enter these lands. The Roxolani nomads had come here to make themselves distinct from the community of allies, and they had come to succeed in learning how to farm and fend with the local Himanians. Yet the coming of decrees from Apollon disturbed them greatly, and they sent reply that they should wish to be independent of the empire and the gods they disdained, and that they should take the liberty of pursuing that independence no matter the thoughts of their prior rulers. Even were there not matters of religion involved, this would be a case when the might of the empire should be used against them quickly, so as to set a legible example. With increasing need to spread knowledge of the gods as far as could be achieved, the distinction between enemies and contentious allies was lessened further, and it was thus that Pairisades forewent the usual procedures for declaring war, and took his army from Apollon to retrace his march and return to the European forests. That he departed without making sacrifices to the gods was an important turning point in demonstrating to the people that suspicions should now be held against the will of the gods, although these things were not yet formally developed at this time, so we shall return to them later. The capital of the Roxolani was called Belz, and was a Himanian farming outpost which had been swelled enormously by the settling of the nomads, such that it was now a small city by way of its population, though its buildings were hardly more permanent than those usually employed by nomads. Pairisades encamped near this city with several thousand riders in the spring of 179 prior. He sent out envoys to begin negotiations, but when he saw that what emerged from the city was not an embassy but an entire army, he began also to file his horsemen from his camp, and it seemed battle was a foregone conclusion in the views of either side. Both sides were armed and deployed in a similar fashion, since the Roxolani were more influenced by Leuthosis' methods of warfare than any other group other than now the Bosporans. The Roxolani thus advanced in a long column of mounted archers, moving to deploy on fields that lay between two forests. The Bosporan army was arrayed in the southern forest, since their camp was behind it, and when Pairisades saw the enemy formation, he agreed with his captains that an attack should be made at once. The Leuthosis went out quickly to cut in front of the Roxolani column, wheeling around to attack it from the north, while others were already shooting from the south. Quickly the front of the column was being assailed from three sides, and it was hoped that this approach could be used to thresh the entire formation from front to back. However, the Roxolani were not surprised by what happened, and quickly revealed they had prepared for the scenario. Firstly, the column reformed to reveal that its center was composed of shielded footmen, which explained their slowness to deploy. Since they were closely packed together, the column had actually contained more troops than it first appeared, and most accounts say that there were twice as many Roxolani as Leuthosis. From the dismounted ranks came warriors in heavy armor that jutted out from its frame from chin to toe, who threw their comrade riders from their horses, mounted up, and charged out in all directions, making full use of the fact that the slow deployment had left the horses with ample energy. Conversely, the Leuthosis were slow to turn and flee, firstly because of the exertion of taking up their formation, and secondly because they had never seen such tactics and did not instinctively know whether to withdraw. Pairisades and his companions were riding up to the scene when they saw that the northern group of the army was retreating into the woods while skirmishing with the enemy infantry. The eastern group was engaged in fierce melee with the advancing column, and the southern group was scattering in panic while the heavy riders hunted them with long lances. Never had the prince been confronted with such a dire scene, although perhaps the blood of his father within him carried memory of maelstroms like the battle that day. Pairisades gave command of the battle to Diotrephes, then departed to rally his troops in person. Diotrephes quickly sent most of the royal cavalry to fetch him back, as the situation across the field was only worsening. To the west, hundreds of riders were positioning themselves to counter-encircle the Leuthosis, and some of the Roxolani had ridden off the field in the direction of the main camp. Diotrephes judged that returning there would be foolish, and in this he showed foresight, for even though retreating through the woods would give the Leuthosis an advantage, the Roxolani already had troops passing through the woods elsewhere to ambush any returning to camp. Instead, the Strategos bid that all who could be reached follow his banner, and that the prince be taken along by force if needs be. He took said banner to the east, away from the gathering bulk of the Roxolani, towards a forested hillside. Seeing this, and hearing the horns of muster singing the way to go, the Leuthosis fled the Roxolani column wherever they could. Pairisades was extracted from the melee at the front of the column and ferried away, shouting out that the battle was not lost and protesting without composure. However, the situation was so strongly to the contrary that regular soldiers were happy to disobey their master and follow the shrinking banner of General Diotrephes instead. The flight did not go uncontested. The Roxolani eagerly pursued, and were only slowed by their own disorganization and desire to capture abandoned horses. Additionally, a sizable portion of their force chased small groups escaping in other directions, so it was only about 1,000 riders who kept close to the main body. Pairisades had around 600 riders with him, having left 1,000 dead or captured on the field, with hundreds more fleeing by their own designs to places unknown. The sky had turned grey, and nothing maintained any luster but for the blood seeping from their wounds. Diotrephes reached the wood atop the steep hill, and endeavoured to plant the command banner in a place where it might be seen by lost allies. There was no sense concealing it from the enemy, since their scouts had kept close contact throughout the pursuit, and were regularly updating the main army on the best route to follow. So it was that the Roxolani began to muster at the base of the hill, unsure of whether their prey had suffered a truly mortal blow, or whether an attack would still entail a brush with defeat. Their delay was pragmatic too, since their footmen were able to catch up on their slower horses, and prepare to march upwards in a shield wall. Atop the hill, Pairisades relied upon Diotrephes to organize the soldiers. The prince was struck with silence, a fairly common thing in fateful times, but rare for one such as he. The spare horses had been lost with the camp, and those they had with them were often wounded or otherwise expended for the time being. Therefore it was difficult to go on from those woods, even with the enemy creeping closer, hardly visible in the dim light of a god-forsaken evening. Nobody was discussing that which had occurred, since there was a pall of shame across all ranks. As much as Pairisades could be blamed for falling into the Roxolani trap, every man with him had felt the same passion doom them equally, and indeed they in particular were not those especially doomed, for which there was shame to be felt in some respects. This was how soldiers often react to seeing the misfortunes of battle vanquish men who did not more or less deserve such a fate as themselves, and it can be hard to reconcile the will of the gods in these moments. Pairisades knew that the will of the gods was no good measure of righteousness, and hence dwelt on it not at all. On the contrary, he struck upon an idea to use the truth of the divine powers in the world to remedy the situation. Let me tell you this story as Diotrephes tells it, and while there are few witnesses to confirm it, it is so remarkable that I cannot think of any other way to explain how the final result of this bleak day was achieved. He began by removing his armor and throwing aside his cloak and tunic. A group of experienced Leuthosis came and helped him with this, and drew out stones, which they used to sharpen a Roxolani arrow. Its head was iron, providing this to the prince. Saying only that he was going to summon strength to aid them, the prince selected the horses who were most heavily wounded, and brought them to the edge of the woods facing the Roxolani. The horses came willingly, their comrades dipping their heads as they passed. Pairisades proceeded to pierce the necks of one horse after another, so that he could have them drain a trail of blood along the enemy path of advance. At first, the horses would be panicked by the pain, but each time Pairisades would then draw the arrow across his own chest and mix flecks of his blood into that dripping onto the soil. This awoke in them the part of their being which stemmed from the first creation, allowing them to understand how they should behave. 7 horses were put to this work, and when the mark of blood was made, they were unbridled and allowed the last of their strength to go off as they pleased. Pairisades was substantially wounded by all he had given and was taken to the rear to lie down. The Leuthosis were satisfied that the ritual had been carried out correctly, and hence they took off their vestments of war and began starting a fire. Other soldiers were indignant at this inappropriate behaviour, with battle at hand, yet they were to be humbled by what came next. The darkening of the sky was hurried along by the unseen forces at play, and rain began to shoot down into the faces of the Roxolani. The Bosporan position remained dry, their fire only growing in strength. Indeed, the rain was falling exclusively on the far side of the blood barrier, and its intensity was unlike anything usually seen in the region. Diotrephes says that it was like all the rain meted for a wide area had been brought together to fall all in one place, and whether or not this was how the world was operating here I cannot say. What we know is that the Roxolani were mired in soft ground and soaked so completely that they had to throw away items to bear the weight of it all. Still, they were able to get close to the top, and those not so faithful in the will of Manos' tripartite believed that arms should be grasped and a last effort be made to die with honourable comportment. Nay. The trees shook as a violent wind crossed the hillside. Pairisades raised his hands and said, "I will never listen to the voices of the cosmos. We will pour to this world out of their reach, if only those who cannot hear the voice of Manos could be cleaned away." After this, the hillside itself began to shimmer with movement. The mud slid away like meat boiled from a bone. The Roxolani horses knew that they had been driven into folly, and either threw off their riders to escape, or fled with their riders hanging on for their lives. The trees that dotted the hillside broke in the wind, and their boughs toppled footmen, who could not evade such things, for the ground was like loose sand. Their attempts to move only drove their feet into the ground, where they were trapped, and those who protested against this the most sank the deepest, and we know from later testimony that some warriors, including their warlord, simply disappeared into the ground. The storm was not especially long, but in the time it raged, it created an incredible river of mud with marshes forming around it, and the Roxolani army was crushed, while the Bosporans warmed their hands around a crackling fire. These Bosporans would not be spared the moans and cries of those trapped in the mud once the weather passed, and it appears that any of their Roxolani comrades still at the base of the hill did not have the courage to ascend and attempt to free the doomed, or if any did, they either gave up or joined the ranks of the doomed themselves. With the fire burning and the banner still flying, Pairisades took the additional measure of having a few fit men ride away in the night to alert any allies they could find. The Roxolani were at leisure to do the same, however, and so even spared from an immediate assault, the situation remained perilous. A night and a day passed, and on the second night, the Bosporans came out of the woods onto the hillside, which had now dried somewhat. The blood barrier was still bright and wet, as if untouched by the withering light of the sun, and the Roxolani trapped in this area cried out in all the languages they knew, which were surprisingly many, that they should either be rescued or killed by spear point, for this was a preferable alternative to a gradual, cruel descent into the earth as the draining water pulled them down with it. Some were in favour of this, since the Roxolani were loud and disturbing, but Pairisades ruled against it. He reasoned that since the world had chosen to consume the souls of these men, doing so to save those of the Bosporans, there should be no alteration of the natural course. Mercy is a force that we feel is imposed upon us from the outside, he declared. We cannot reason our way to it. We simply receive its will from above, from beyond. We do not know how much damage to our fortunes we would do if we listened to it. So, listen to reason, and think on what we have learned. If we make good on our promises, we shall see the next step on our path, clear and bright, tinged with gold by praise. And that is why the Bosporans camped again on the hillside and did not permit themselves to listen to pleas from any source. In this time, the Roxolani had gathered up their column and were ready to assault the hill in greater force than before, whereas Pairisades had received no reinforcements, and in fact had seen several men pass beyond use by the worsening of their wounds. In the morning, the region was covered in mist, but the approach of the Roxolani was discerned by the noise of it, so the Bosporans came to the edge of the woods to investigate. The hillside had dried out, and there were no signs of those once struggling there, consumed with all their equipment and the gashes in the earth already sealed. Seeing this, the Leuthosis were impressed. Pairisades had around 100 horses fit for battle, and he picked out the men who should ride them, along with himself. His exact intention is unclear, because Diotrephes wrote of this morning as if the prince had become delirious, although no stories like this came from the soldiers later. Diotrephes claimed that the prince believed victory would be granted by a miracle, as long as he was willing to put himself at risk, and this was at least somewhat in line with what Manos intended for the world. He invoked the spirit I passingly criticized earlier in this work, the spirit of Alexander, or specifically that a leader of military forces should go first and foremost where the risk and glory was maximal. Although Alexander had behaved like this for his own reasons, Pairisades supposedly believed that the successes of the Macedonians had actually been granted by the fates because Alexander was acting according to the will of Manos. Those of us familiar with history know that Alexander tended to act rather contrary to Manos's kingly ideals in almost all other respects of his life, so it's hard to swallow this theory in its entirety. But it was something the prince was said to have been entertaining when he chose to lead a charge down the hill into the oncoming Roxolani army. It is said that when he set off, the whole hillside shone with a golden light, and the mist was cast away before him to reveal the disposition of his enemy. The Roxolani were not all together, climbing the hill in various groups so that they could stick to the driest routes. When the leading groups saw the horses coming, even though there were not very many, they ran back down the hill to join with those behind them. Since there were yet more further down, the race backwards continued, always searching for greater safety and military advantage. And then the Bosporans were upon them at their backs with arrows and spears. Weapons were thrown aside by those whose taste for running down the hill was now fully risen, and while braver warriors came up on horses to fight the Bosporans, they were ill at ease with the golden light on the muddy hillside, knowing that strangeness had visited the area recently, and suspecting strongly that the ordeal was not over. Therefore, the Roxolani performed poorly in battle, and left the hill to the Bosporans after suffering many hundreds of losses. Their army still had thousands of warriors to count upon in the region, and a continued siege of the hillside might have garnered them a satisfying conclusion to all these unusual turns. Yet one turn remained, most dissatisfying to those who would rebel against the Scions of Gold. From the north came another column of riders, flying a yellow banner, which the Roxolani recognized as being one of those flown in their stronghold at Bells. Seeing this, they of course thought they were being reinforced. Therefore, they were slow to react when this new force fanned to the flanks and brought out their bows to release arrows into the Roxolani without any stopping of the horses. Not knowing who they were, the Bosporans were happy to join the fray regardless, and attacked as soon as the Roxolani turned to face this new threat. It was here, in the bog at the base of the hill, that the migrant traitors were slain in the open, man by man, and since the bodies from that battle were never recovered, we can assume that the bog consumed them too, and that those who fell on the first day were reunited with those who fell on the last. The army which had come was of Scythian allies from the Tauris Peninsula, who had ridden far with the intent of winning territory in the same fashion as the Roxolani. Since they had come upon war and been informed of the situation by those men Pairisades had managed to slip away, they promptly sacked Bells and came out to shatter the Roxolani claim in battle, and thus they hoped to take that claim themselves. Pairisades was more than happy to give over the majority of the spoils to the new arrivals. They were all amazed when they heard the story of what had happened, and after the business of the day was concluded, the leading men of the Scythians came to bow before Pairisades and offer him praise for his connection to the gods. They did not understand that it was his lack of connection to the gods which was now empowering him. An interesting note is that Pairisades recognized some of the warlords who had come, for they were of the same tribe he had treated with in his younger days, and ultimately betrayed in stealing the very tablets which began this wonderful affair. It was indicative of their change of heart that they were now bowing before him, when in actuality they had the ideal chance to quietly take their revenge and be rid of him in those quiet hills. But after the display Pairisades had put on, Manos would never allow such a thing. Not yet, at least. In the time after this drama, The original battlefield was taken into state ownership, so that it could be used for rituals and to commemorate those days. The rest of the region was proclaimed New Scythia by the questing nomads, which created an intriguing reflection in that the westernmost edge of the empire was called New Scythia, while the easternmost was called Old Scythia. What precisely the word Scythian meant was diluted yet further, and that has always been the way with peoples who came from the east. Politically, the fate of the Roxolani and the miraculous action of the battle was dragged above the news that the Leuthosis army had been defeated and almost destroyed, and the objective of setting an example to those who rejected the new authority of the empire was achieved. The exact nature of this authority, of the Scions of Gold, I have yet to lay out, and that is because in these first years it was not the rigid and simple to describe force that it later became. However, important men were on the verge of learning all that there was to learn, and it would be put to the test whether they were able to hear the wisdom of Manos, or whether they carried the curse that rendered them blind to the truth. To begin to convey ideas like these, I will bring us to another large and all-important conference of the era. Pairisades had entertained himself and made his mark in Apollon. Now it was time for King Spartacus to storm back onto the scene at the official capital of Tanais and discover all that there was to know about his empire, his world, and what desperate hands were outstretching to him, begging to feel even the shadow of his power. And he saw in all this a path to immortal greatness, one that ran to the horizon, but alas, no further.